Hey, what's going on, guys? It's your boy Tillman with another Tillman Take. A lot of you guys have been wondering whether or not the force that Rialto police used on the 16-year-old juvenile was justified or not. I don't know. There's only one way to find out. Let's get into it.
Ryan Tillman, real talk, it's the truth.
The family of a 16-year-old girl is demanding answers after this video shows a Rialto police officer grabbing the girl by the neck. During a news conference today, her parents announced they are pursuing legal action. NBC4's Tony Shin has more of this video. It's an incident that's gone viral.
This video is from February 11th, when two Rialto officers stop a 16-year-old girl who was allegedly speeding while riding an illegal motorbike on city streets. The situation escalates as the officers try to arrest her after they say she refused to identify herself and tell them her age. The video shows one officer forcing her to the ground and then grabbing her by the throat as she screams.
All right, guys, now that we watched this video, the question we all have to ask ourselves is whether or not the force that Rialto police used on this 16-year-old girl was justified or not. But the only way to do that is we have to break things down from the very beginning. We have to understand why the officers were called there, why they decided to use force, and whether or not any of that stuff was either out of play or in play. So let's first start with the call or why they stopped her. Now, I've read some articles, and it sounds like they stopped her because she was riding some type of unauthorized motor vehicle on the road. It sounded like a scooter, one of those motorized scooters that people ride. Because she was riding this unauthorized vehicle on the roadway, the officers had probable cause to conduct a traffic stop. Now, we got to start there because we have to ask ourselves, do the officers even have a lawful reason to talk to her while she's minding her own business? And the answer to that is yes. They have a lawful reason to talk to her because she's violating a vehicle code. So they stop her, they detain her for this violation, and then things start to go south from there. Well, what is one of the things that started it to go south? Well, anytime you're detained by a police officer and they have a valid reason to detain you, one of the first things you have to do is you have to identify yourself if they ask you to identify yourself. And so they asked her to identify herself and she failed to do so. Now you have to realize there's a couple things here. Is she's 16 years old, and because she's 16 years old and she is lawfully detained for a violation, they have to release her to an adult, especially if she's riding an unauthorized vehicle. She fails to identify herself, and that's kind of where the slippery slope starts to begin, where she's now no longer complying with the instructions that they've given her. Now, obviously, they haven't released the body cam footage of this altercation yet, and so there's a lot of loopholes. There's a lot of areas that we can't make assumptions on just because we haven't seen the whole altercation. But what we do know is that an altercation started because she failed to identify herself. So in doing so, obviously, at some point in time, the officers went to detain her or place her in handcuffs. That's where the video really starts, where we see officers wrestling with her. The question becomes did the officers have a right to use force on this young girl while they're trying to detain her? So there's a few things that we have to know when it comes to using force. When it comes to using force, there's three factors that we have to consider: were the officers trying to effect an arrest, were the officers trying to prevent her escape, or were the officers trying to overcome her resistance? If they're trying to do one of those three things or all of them, they have the ability to use reasonable force. Well, do we know what type of resistance she was offering yet? We don't know. And the reason I say we don't know is because in the articles that I've read, it also says that she attempted to bite her or to bite the officers. Now, if she's actually attempting to bite the officers, that may be a means for the officers to use a certain level of force in order to overcome that resistance. There's a lot of factors that are included when we bite somebody. Some of those factors to consider if a person is trying to bite me are, do they have a communicable disease? And if they do, then, obviously that's dangerous to me. Do they break the skin? Do you start to bleed? There's so many other things. So that's a reason for an officer to try to overcome that resistance in order to effect that arrest. The other things to consider is, when they're trying to overcome that resistance, what is the appropriate level of force that an officer can use? There's a lot of things that will determine whether it's appropriate level of force to be used. But we can't jump to conclusions based off of watching this video and determine what the appropriate level of force those officers can use was, just simply because we don't know if she was successful in biting them. We don't know how many times she tried to bite them, and we don't know what their police department policy dictates. Every police department has a police department policy, and in that policy, there's a use of force continuum that basically tells us this is the type of force that you can use for certain levels of threats that are being offered or posed by the suspect that you're dealing with. And so for us to jump to conclusions to say that those officers were wrong for trying to tackle her to overcome that resistance, we can't say that yet. Is it possible that they could have used excessive force? It is possible. It is absolutely possible, but we won't know that until the investigation is over. So that's one thing to consider when we're determining whether or not the officers use the appropriate level of force to detain her. Now, some people are going to say, is it appropriate that the officers utilized a neck restraint or put his hands around the girl's neck? One, it looks atrocious. And again, as a dad, I would be furious if I saw this in my daughter being on the receiving end of this. But we don't know if this was reactionatory. Now, I'm not making excuses for this officer, so I don't want you guys to confuse my words. I'm not making excuses because it definitely looks bad. But there's times where if a person is offering a level of resistance and you're trying to, out of pure reaction, you're trying to stop them or prevent them, especially if we're talking about her biting you and you're trying to get her mouth away from your arms or whatever it is, that could be a pure reaction that happened or why he did it. But I could be wrong. There could be a no place for him to do that, and I highly doubt that his policy approves him utilizing such a use of force like that. So again, in order for us to completely determine that, we have to wait for the facts to come out. Now, there's been some speculation as to what happened after this arrest and when she got into the police car and things like that. Those are things that we don't know. Again, we have to wait to see what comes out of it. But I will tell you that anytime we're evaluating a situation like this, there's more than meets the eye. I've dealt with juveniles so many times as a former school resource officer where I was dealing with people that were 12 to 18 years old on any given day. And there were times that I got to, I talked a person into handcuffs, and there was times that I had to use a level of force. So we can't always be distracted just simply by the age, because even though she's 16 years old, age doesn't have a limit on the amount of force that they can use or pose to the officers that are trying to apprehend her. So we can't be distracted by the age. We have to be, fixated on was the level of force they use appropriate with the amount of resistance that she was offering. The other thing I've also heard is, how come these officers didn't de-escalate? Now, de-escalation has become a catchphrase. It's used all over the place. Are officers de-escalating? Are they trained to de-escalate? Yes, we're trained to de-escalate, but let me ask and pose you the question is, how do you de-escalate a person who's unwilling to be de-escalated? Does that make sense? So if I try to go de-escalate a person, if they don't want to be de-escalated, how am I going to de-escalate? So we don't even know if that was a factor here. Do we know if the officers tried to de-escalate before putting handcuffs on her? What was the conversation like? Did they ask her nicely? Were they making forceful threats to her, or not threats, or forceful commands to her? We don't know whether or not they de-escalated or didn't de-escalate just because we didn't see that video that led up to. So there's a lot of unknown questions in this video. I wanted to unpack some of the main things for you guys to look at when evaluating whether or not this force was reasonable or not. I'm not going to go out on a limb and say it was reasonable or unreasonable just because there's a lot of unknown factors. But what I wanted to do was give you guys some key pointers and key things to look at when you guys are evaluating to determine whether or not this was right or wrong. So I hope this helps you guys out. Thanks again, guys, and God bless.
Ryan Tillman, real talk, it's the truth.